Thanks everybody for being here with us. Also thanks to Ruben, Courtney, and Eddie who are helping us out with this workshop. I apologize if the screen is a little small. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, hence the delay. We also apologize for that. But in the chat, there's a link to a PDF of the slides. So just click on that link and you can follow and get the PDF. Our goal here today is to provide a research update by responding to 3 questions that we commonly hear from parents, clinicians, and other researchers. So we're going to introduce each question and present some of the relevant research, and then we're going to take questions. So please feel free to ask questions during the presentation via the chat box. Courtney's going to track the questions as we go, and then we'll answer the questions at the end of the presentation, which will be in about 20 minutes or so. So the first question that we're going to tackle here is, do parents or environment cause stuttering? Many of you may know the answer to this question. But at the same time, many parents of young children who stutter continue to be told, just ignore it and it'll go away, which in my view perpetuates the thinking that parents do something to make their child stutter. One good approach to answering this question is to talk about the neurobiological data that indicate that kids who stutter are in fact set up to stutter or predisposed to stutter. So first we're going to tackle genetics very briefly. It is well known that stuttering runs in families and that kids who stutter are more likely to continue stuttering into adulthood if they have a family member who also persisted into adulthood. Over the last 10 or so years, scientists have made some important discoveries about the genetic bases of stuttering. Specifically, Dennis Drana and his colleagues at the NIH have identified several genetic mutations that are present in some people who stutter. The identified genes are related to lysosomal function, which is essentially, broadly speaking, a metabolic process in cells that cleans out the cells. And these mutations were found in about 15 to 20% of people who stutter. Interestingly, when these mutations were simulated in mice by a process known as knocking out, which is essentially deactivating the same genes that were found in the adults who stutter in the mice, because they have those genes as well. The mouse pup calls, the mouse pups were 7 days old, I believe, but their vocalization, their calls were interrupted in a way that was reflective of stuttering. Things like hesitations and other vocal characteristics of the mice were not affected. So it specifically affected what the researchers described as the flow of speech. How much like stuttering were these interrupted vocalizations from the knocked out mice? That's debatable. We don't have time to do that here today, but the fact that knocking out the genes led to this kind of atypical flow in speech, and that other vocal characteristics in the mice were typical, is intriguing. So these mice were also found to exhibit abnormal astrocytes, which are cells in the body that, again, broadly speaking, support brain function. Abnormal astrocytes have been associated with other neurodevelopmental disorders, and astrocytes are known to be densely populated in corpus callosum. which is a band of nerve fibers that connects the two hemispheres of the brain, so the left and the right hemisphere. So why is this important? Well, because when we look at the brains of people who stutter, we see atypical patterns between the hemispheres, what scientists refer to as atypical cerebral laterality. These differences include reduced white matter integrity and gray matter volume in the left hemisphere. These are differences in structure of the brain, and seemingly reversed patterns in the right hemisphere. And as a possible result, we think that, well, we know this to be the case, and it might possibly be a result of the differences in structure, that people who stutter exhibit reduced activation in the left hemisphere and increased activation in the right hemisphere. So if you look at these pretty pictures of the brains up here, on the top left is is showing the left hemisphere, the bottom left is showing the right hemisphere. These ovals, these colored ovals, the blue and red oval, roughly correspond to some important speech regions. And the blue is indicating that there's underactivation there, and then the red is indicating that there's overactivation there. And this may result from issues with communication between the two hemispheres. So if you remember, astrocytes, which are particularly concentrated in corpus callosum, were less prevalent in the knocked out mice, so the genetically altered mice, essentially. It's possible that this is also the case in humans, and that this would lead to problems in the connections between the two hemispheres, which is potentially why we are seeing these differential activation patterns between the left and the right hemisphere. So certainly we need more data to confirm that this is the case in humans. But when you start putting the pieces together from parent report, genetic data, neuroimaging data, it is certainly plausible that these astrocytes in the corpus callosum, or these atypical astrocytes in corpus callosum, are important contributors to the pathophysiology of stuttering. So to get back to the question, and before I hand things off to Nan, there is no evidence that parents cause stuttering, and genetic and corresponding neurological data continue to show more and more that our kids who persist in stuttering are set up to persist, right? So the answer seems, it's highly, highly likely is the safe way to put it. The not so safe way to put it is no, parents or environment do not cause stuttering. This is not to say though that parents can't influence a child's stuttering, in the sense that, for example, responding negatively to stuttering may increase the difficulty that the child has in responding to stuttering. And of course, parents can also do things that may benefit the child, supporting ways that the child can respond to when they stutter, how they feel about being a person who stutters. I think Nan's going to touch on a couple of these things in the next question. But again, the data show that it's highly, highly unlikely that parents cause stuttering. So I'm going to hand it off to Nan. I don't know if you want to add anything. to this?
Sure, a couple of things. First of all, the astrocytes that you're talking about, Adam hasn't got a clear view of what they mean. So they're a type of brain cell, and they are, what's nice about the research that's coming together, and I want to praise Eric for trying to pull together in the past couple of years about 50 or 60 studies that are fairly complicated, that basically these are a type of brain cell that help communication among brain regions, and they are directly expressed out of the genes that are now being implicated. So that what's really interesting is that the genes that are being implicated are directly associated both in mice and in human models, actually, with a particular type of brain cell. And so the puzzle pieces are starting to come together in interesting ways. The one thing I will sort of note that, because Eric was talking about knocking out mice, is that it took them a while to knock out these mice, and it's not clear they can—
Oh, it's not a simple process?
Right, and they can't knock out the people. And we don't think they're going to knock out the people anytime soon. And the reason is there won't be a knockout gene for stuttering, because the kind of, the actual genetic trait that's being identified here actually is more usually expressed in humans as something called a lysosomal storage disorder. Don't worry about trying to define that. It kills people, okay? So they had a hard time actually getting living mice to express this gene. And it's not likely that people would want to meddle with it in real people. I see the question that the mutations are not found in everybody, and in fact, at least those mutations are not found in everybody. But the more we identify various genetic markers, and there are actually a lot of suspects, this is just the one gene that Eric spent time talking about is really a specific gene where all the pieces are starting to come together, because it's responsible for something that we actually see different in the brains of people who stutter, and even different in the brains of kids who recover and don't recover. It's expressed differently. And so that's actually what's exciting about this. And then if we can identify more genes, then in fact, we may be on our way to trying to figure out what happens for the rest of the population of people who stutter. I think one of the things I'm going to continue to say, so I'll say it really fast here, is that parents or the environment are kind of loaded terms, particularly the term environment. And there is no doubt that there is an environment for the fetus before it's born, and a number of things that happen in human beings that create disorder are actually the result of things that trigger behaviors before the baby is actually born. So, you know, there's stress on the fetus, splitting of cells when kids twin, things like that we're not talking about parenting when we talk about environment in a genetic sense of the word. It's not always talking about parenting. There are, just, I guess to close this out, there are no data that suggests that parents are capable of actually starting a child down the road of stuttering. As Eric said, there are plenty of things that they can do that will probably make the child's life better or not as smooth, but that whatever triggers the first stutter is not, as far as we can tell, and this body of data is just growing and growing and growing, that there are hard scientific data that suggests that stuttering is the result of some form of genetically influenced brain difference. And parents really don't yet, they've not been found to have any role in brain maturation in that specific way.
We have one more question here that was sent privately. Kim wants to know if you could talk a little bit more about the studies with humans, and are there any genetic components that they're finding in humans who stutter?
So let me just jump in. So we think that it might be best to take all of the questions at the end, just when we get through the slides. So maybe Courtney, maybe you could remind us of that question when we get through. Okay. All right, Nan.
Okay, we're next going to tackle some recent literature looking at stuttering therapy in young children, and does it work, and how well does it work? So there was a very, very interesting article recently that in which the Dutch conducted the largest randomized clinical trial of stuttering treatment that the world has ever seen. And what was interesting is that in that study, which pitted two different therapies head to head, which is actually kind of unusual in our literature anyhow. Most people just do one type of therapy and report it, or another type of therapy and report it. What happened in the Netherlands, and it was actually led by a very well-known researcher there, Marie-Christine Franken, is that they used lid cone therapy, which is an Australian operant therapy, and they used what they call more of a demands and capacities model. It had a lot of moving parts, but basically it involved direct work with children on fluency, shaping fluency, counseling parents and things like that. Basically, the two arms wound up at the end of a year, and now at the end of 2 years, being pretty much indistinguishable in terms of how many children seemed to reach a point at which they didn't stutter to a certain criterion. So they seemed to be essentially well treated. And the problem is that the eventual number is that it really doesn't look all that different from what we'd expect if you didn't treat children at all. So it was a number in the high 70s, about 78% of the kids in either arm got better. And most statistics for natural recovery in children say that we should expect about 4/5 or 80% of kids to outgrow stuttering on their own. So it doesn't appear, at least from this largest study we have access to, that stuttering treatment changes what might have happened anyhow. So the analogy that I like to use in these cases is to think about the treatment as being a little bit more like aspirin for a headache. That in most cases, if you have a headache, it's going to go away on its own, and you take aspirin to kind of speed up the process. And that's what appears to perhaps be happening in this large-scale study report. That doesn't mean, of course, that getting stuttering and the child to be in better shape faster rather than slower is necessarily a bad thing. But it does mean that we're not sure that treatment has a noticeably better impact than waiting. I noticed for myself on feedback, I'm breaking up a little bit. Am I able to be heard by people?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So what it also says to us, meaning Eric and me, when we look at the literature, is that it really suggests to us, and I'll admit I had this bias anyhow, that working only to ameliorate speech symptoms in kids who stutter may not, in fact, be a very wise course of action if it really can't improve in the end on the eventual sort of stutter-free speech that you would perhaps look for in treatment as a result of treatment. And so it may be more important than ever, in our opinion, to try to be sure that therapies for young children focus not just on speech tools, but focus on other aspects of the child's functioning, their self-image, their resiliency, how to get out of a stutter if you're in it, and things that we would normally consider to be, at least in some circles, a more rounded approach to treating stuttering than simply trying to deal with speech symptoms. So we won't argue with some people who say, and you can go to the next slide and we'll spare a lot of time, I think, for discussion of this, that, that stuttering therapy for children does work. And it certainly works for a number of children, perhaps 4/5 of them, to ameliorate speech symptoms. The real question is not whether or not it worked, but whether or not doing nothing would have worked if you waited longer. But we do think that addressing problems when they start, particularly if children are perturbed, is a very good idea. What it's leaving us with is a reservation that if all we pay attention to young preschool children who stutter is simply thinking about the fluency of their speech, we may be missing something very important later on, which is that these some of these children will get better, but some may not. And if they don't get better in the sense of not stuttering as much, which is what a lot of parents are looking for, and unfortunately a lot of therapists, then have we missed time to address other kinds of skills that we want to help children develop when they stutter. So yeah, so
I would just add, I would just add that I think it's also a really important lesson about science, that sometimes it does take a long time. And it's also really important, I think, for parents to be, I'm not sure if skeptical is the best word, but definitely critical thinkers when it comes to looking for therapy for their child, and also during the process of therapy, right? Because for a really long time, because the LIDCOM program put out most of the research, which was reported to be in a randomized clinical control format. We could argue about that was whether that was actually the case or not. But for a long time, there were proponents of this one particular program, LIDCOM, that this was the gold standard for treatment. And then after all these years, when there was a systematic study that was done that compared these two, well, really we're kind of seeing they seem similar in the output that the researchers were looking at. So I think there's an important lesson there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
The last question that we're going to try and tackle is stuttering a speech disorder, or just a speech disorder, or primarily a speech disorder. And so we're going to take a close look at this. This is definitely a way in which we're trying to pull together Eric and I are trying to pull together a huge array of literature that I'm not sure how you collapse it other than by asking this question. So historically, of course, when people look at a person who stutters, what we see are the behaviors, and we see things that obviously look like speech behaviors. And stuttering is, in this sense, mainly been defined by its observable symptoms. And for a long time, particularly if you're somebody like me and I write a research book on stuttering, it's crazy because it really confined the research for so many years to only looking at things that revolve around the lips and the larynx and the tongue and things like that. But the more research that we look at these days, especially with newer tools that we have that can look at brain function as people do things, we can read from the brain interesting features of language formulation, language understanding, memory and cognition, temperament, emotion, these sorts of things. The more that we look at the brains of children and adults who stutter and use this new science to look at what's differentiating these speakers from speakers who are typically fluent, is that the brain of children and adults who stutter shows differences in lots of different ways. And we can relate almost all of them to what stuttering eventually looks like and how people who stutter eventually think and feel. And so it just seems that there are too many parts of the human brain in speakers who stutter that show differences that are interesting and make a certain amount of conceptual sense, that to simply think of stuttering as starting at the level of speech is really probably making too simple an argument, that it seems to start way back further in the system and starts with things like language formulation, like supports for memory, like, for instance, thresholds for temperament and things like that. And so it really seems to us, at least, and Eric and I both have degrees in communication disorders where if you have the intro book, they always stick stuttering in the they always divide the world into speech, language, and hearing disorders, and they always stick stuttering in the speech disorder section, that if stuttering is a speech disorder, it's a mighty weird one, actually. It doesn't look like any of the others, and it seems to have its roots in too many other areas of human function. And so our answer to this question is that we believe that stuttering is not primarily a speech disorder. It has speech symptoms, but unlike other disorders of childhood that involve speech, for instance, stuttering has an onset, which other childhood speech disorders do not. It seems to involve other areas of function, which in things like an articulation disorder, it does not. Children who start to stutter seem really upset by it. I think we all know that. And children who have articulation problems do not have a problem with how they sound typically. And so whatever's going on in stuttering, it does involve speech, but we think that maybe thinking about it pure and simply as a speech disorder is not the best approach. And my final comment, I shared with Eric that as a person who often goes out and trains folks in the school systems who work with kids with communication disorders, when we make stuttering seem like a speech disorder, clinicians and parents and principals think about the fact that when they have children who have articulation problems, that after a little bit of therapy, they're good to go and they never have a problem again. And I think that that really makes it a particularly vicious viewpoint to have about stuttering, is that if we think it's just a speech disorder, we may expect it to respond to therapy in the very quick and easy way that, saying, having a bad S does, when in fact we know that stuttering treatment is way more complicated, and that it would be really unreasonable to expect most kids who stutter to graduate from speech therapy with no concerns at all about their fluency after a semester of treatment, which is certainly well within the range of possibilities for children who have articulation problems. Eric?
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, that was so well said. I'll just add that I think a good way to think about this is that speech, the overt speech behaviors, are just kind of the end of the chain, right? So they're certainly necessary, and certainly they are the most salient or the most noticeable features of stuttering. But as Nan was saying, to think of this just as a speech disorder is a gross oversight of the problem. I mean, in my lab, we study the variability of stuttering, why people stutter sometimes and not others, and we're specifically interested in phenomena like anticipation. Anticipation is the speaker's ability to know before they produce overt speech that they're going to stutter. Well, and this is the case in kids and adults. It's a little more complicated and probably more prevalent in adults. It is more prevalent in adults, but kids anticipate as well. And what can a kid do when he or she anticipates stuttering? Well, they could choose to stall, delay, or not talk at all, right? So you in my view anyway, you have a stuttering event there. It's just that it never made its way out to the surface, right? Because the speaker, with this knowledge of upcoming stuttering, sort of circumvented the presentation of the behavior. And there's also things like when people speak out loud alone, this phenomenon called private speech, they don't stutter, right? I have some interesting data that we are writing up in my lab right now, but if they're not stuttering when the kind of communicative aspect is not there, then that really tells you something about what goes into contributing to stuttering events. And I just think it's really important to take those into consideration. And I think in the end, what it tells us is that exactly as I think that I might even go with a hard no here, is that there's so many more factors that are important in the manifestation of stuttering events. So, okay.
Can I just add something, because we do have a chat
please.
question related to this as we transition.
Great.
So one of the questions was, what are some of these differences that you're talking about that aren't speech? And one of my favorite examples, because it seems, I think, a little bit more approachable, at least in my opinion, is we can monitor how the brain listens to language, so we don't have to involve talking at all. And numerous studies now of both children and adults who stutter show that they literally process language in different parts of the brain and do so in different ways. And it would take a little bit of time to explain that, but for instance, things that process, for instance, how you put the grammar of a sentence together or how you pick your words, don't seem to be represented in the same way if you look at the brain while it's trying to figure out sentences that it hears. And what's really interesting about that work, which is mainly being done at Purdue University, is that children who become persistent, who don't outgrow stuttering, show the most obvious differences, along with adults who still stutter. And children who outgrow stuttering wind up having brain reactions to language, even if they're not talking, that look a lot more like those of children who've never stuttered. So these are the kinds of examples. There are some in memory as well, that whatever's going on in the brain is involving way more than, say, the motor strip for stuttering.
Well said. So let's go to some questions now. Courtney, are you able to help us out here?
Sure. Yeah, you all read most of the questions, but let me see if there's one. Yeah, I think you answered all the questions that we have so far. So
except for the one about different types of therapy. Hi, Michael. I see that, yes. Give me 1 second to respond to the person who's asking about a specific form of therapy like turtle speech. The problem with many, that is sort of what was part of the Dutch study. That was part of what one of the arms looked at, first of all, because they were looking at rate and speech fluency shaping kinds of techniques. But the problem that we have in general asking about individual forms of therapy that your child might be getting is that when you have a disorder that gets better on its own 80% of the time, research to show what's doing a better job than that involves hundreds and hundreds of children statistically in order to get an answer. And so it's one more way in which stuttering is kind of, you know, punished us in a way for because it has such a good recovery rate that you need big studies to show that anything works. And so number one, it was part of what was done in that study, and it didn't seem a whole lot better than recovery, natural recovery, although it did hasten things, it quickened things. But that looking forward, you know, tracking what therapies work is just a really huge problem and a huge task. So Michael Boyle has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Nan. Hi, Eric. Nice to see you again.
Hey, Michael.
Virtually. Yeah. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for this update. I have a question about the first part, which Eric talked about with the astrocytes and the corpus callosum specifically. I'm curious, you know, very often when I read things like this, the discussion tends to center on either the left or the right hemisphere and kind of looking at those in isolation very often. I'm curious what implications there would be for an interruption or a disconnect between left and right in terms of, so like for example, why is that interconnectivity between left and right hemisphere important for normal speech, and what would it say then about stuttering if there were some interruption between those? How might that interruption actually lead to the behaviors that we notice as stuttering? Any thoughts on that?
Eric, can I say something really fast?
Please, yeah, definitely.
It really was not, we were not able to summarize some of the more interesting literature that I'm unfortunately plowing through right now for the chapter on the brain and stuttering for the handbook. But it's no more, it's not really right and left anymore, it's networks. and communication among regions. So while there's something to the earlier observations that it's right versus left, but it's much more about communication among lots of brain regions, including subcortical regions, which really don't wind up with the easy right-left kind of distinction. And so it's really actually causing a certain amount of distress to try and summarize this stuff, because not only is there so much literature, but you can't put it in the old cubby holes anymore. It's really very difficult in that regard. Eric?
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree that it's about networks. And I think most scientists are in a way appreciating that now. However, as was mentioned, it does seem like there are still a lot of focused hypotheses about these particular regions. So the old thinking was that that the right hemisphere is making up for some kind of deficiency in the left hemisphere, and it may interestingly. We currently have some data in my lab on stuttered versus non-stuttered speech, where we are in fact seeing this same pattern, right? So for stuttered versus non-stuttered speech, there's this underactivation in the left hemisphere and this overactivation in the right hemisphere homologue, right? So to some degree, these same regions in both hemispheres have to be related. And I think that's why this whole story with the corpus callosum is an interesting one. I mean, it may be the case that for the person who stutters, in order to compensate for stuttering or to produce fluent speech, he or she actually needs to sort of send the right into overdrive. And certainly that's, it's speculation. It's actually been speculation for some time. And what I think we need to really answer this question is more studies on stuttered speech. You know, I don't know, I want to estimate 98% of the brain imaging studies look at the fluent speech of people who stutter. And whenever I tell people that, they think who are not in this field, they think that I'm crazy. It's like, why would you look at fluent speech if what you're studying is stuttering? So I think in order to unravel some of these questions, Michael, I think we need more research that actually looks at comparing stuttered versus non-stuttered speech. And then of course, thinking about the networks involved in stuttering as wide-ranging, as opposed to like just, for example, inferior frontal gyrus and premotor cortex.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I think we probably have time for one more. And I should say also that we are happy to take questions via email after the presentation. So please feel free to email either of us or both of us.
Or both of us, yeah. We're very happy to take this well past the end of the session. And if you have questions, we're both great pen pals. Anything else?
So I can't see the chat, so I'm relying on others right now, but I suppose there may be no question. Well, we are at 4:45 Eastern.
Well,
so
hopefully we've given you a little bit of an idea. There's a lot of stuff out there, and Eric's sources, Eric did a masterful job of pulling up all the basic literature, which if anybody has insomnia, the primary literature is a great way of putting you back to sleep. Yeah. So if you have more questions, we're just really happy to track them down and answer them later.
And just one more thing too, without the participation of people who stutter, it's impossible to conduct research. So I see that I have a typo here, but I do have a database here that if you are interested in potentially participating in future research on stuttering, we'd be so grateful. If your child might be, you could sign up using the same database, and we'd appreciate that. Okay, Dan, thanks. It was so much fun putting this together with you.
Yep. Bye, folks.
All right, bye, everybody.
See you later. Thanks.